Chapter 23, A Question of Survival. On February 20th, Nicole gave birth to a healthy baby boy weighing just under 8 pounds. Ari learned of the event a week later when he received in the mail an announcement of the birth of Ari Paul de Benoits. Enclosed was a picture of mother and child taken in the hospital. Nicole was looking proudly and protectively down at the small bundle in her arms. Along with the vital statistics was this note in a familiar hand. "He looks so much like you, Ari, and he's such a good baby. You'd be proud of him. Would you like me to bring him over sometime? Lots of love, Niki." Eyes blurring with tears, Ari read and reread the note, coming back again and again to those words. He looks so much like you, Ari. The woman he had passionately loved had given birth to his child, the baby he had wanted her to abort. Perhaps he had been wrong to insist upon that invasion. Yes, he'd made a tactical blunder. It had been a monumental folly that he'd come to profoundly regret. How he missed her, yet he had never admitted his remorse to Nicole. He'd been prevented from doing so by circumstances beyond his control, and entirely her fault. Nicole's newfound religious zeal had grown into an irrational fanaticism that made reconciliation impossible. Even in this, however, he had to shoulder much of the blame. There was no escaping the fact that he had driven her away, and into the arms of those religious fanatics. His all-consuming passion to bring down the wall had numbed his own natural feelings and left him sadly out of touch with Nicole's feminine emotions. Looking back, as he had so often during these lonely months, Ari could see with crystal clarity that he had driven her into this religious obsession. But after that, it had no longer been his doing. An alien force with which he was incapable of coping had taken over. Nicole was in the grip of a powerful superstition, driven by primal instincts deep in the collective unconscious of the human race. Such was the only plausible explanation for the otherwise inexplicable madness that drove the zealots of all religions, whether Catholics and Protestants in Ireland, the Shiites of Iran, or the Muslims and Hindus in India, with a blind passion that no other power on earth could command. Nicole's totally irrational and unjustifiable commitment to Jesus Christ made it impossible for Ari to live with her in any kind of harmony. Religion had erected an insurmountable barrier between them. On that issue, she was now more stubborn than he had ever been on anything. That unyielding stance made his pain the more unbearable. That this worse-than-impostor Christ figure, a fabrication of the warped minds of power-hungry religious leaders, stood as an alien between them was maddening. Ari found it unbearable that another man had stolen Nicole's affection. A man who had possibly never lived, whom she had certainly never met, but about whom such fantastic tales had been told that he was now a cult figure with hundreds of millions of followers. It was insane. Ari had never denied the hypothetical existence of some higher power behind the universe. But if this god of Nicole's was indeed in charge of human affairs, as she insisted, then it was he who had ordained the birth of this unwelcome child. If Nicole could prove beyond reasonable doubt the existence of this God, whom she seemed to equate with Jesus Christ, oh yes, she told him with childish confidence, God became a man to show us his love. It would only have justified Ari's hatred of him. In spite of the excruciating pain the decision brought to him, Ari had concluded that it was clearly best, yes, even for the child's own good, for him never to see this little son who bore his name. As for Nicole, it was also better never to see her again. The only hope for full healing of that emptiness inside would be to put her completely out of his mind. That was also the only way of preventing her from pressing her religious ideas on him, which she seemed unable to refrain from doing whenever they met, in spite of his strongly worded objections. That Nicole had become a Christian gave Ari more sorrow than if she had died. He couldn't bear to think of her the way she was now. What a contrast the past years of happiness were. Yes, it was as though she had died already. And instead of mourning, he would let the past be as though it had never been. That settled, Ari slipped the birth announcement and picture between 2 volumes on the top row of the bookshelves over his desk, determined to put the past behind him and never to look back. Not an easy thing to do, but by sheer willpower he would accomplish what logic dictated as the only course to take for his own emotional survival. It would be best for Nicole as well. The bleak days of winter merged and passed in gray and dreary progression as Ari mechanically went about the management of his ever-shrinking sphere of influence. It was a labor now devoid of joy, though not of passion. He found himself engaged in consolidating his power in Eastern Europe and laying plans for extending the mushrooming reforms into the Soviet Union. When that task was accomplished, he would take his revolution to the West. There were, however, troubling signs that his days of usefulness were numbered. Subtle at first, the indications grew clearer that his position was weakening. The harbingers of serious trouble became increasingly ominous. The student demonstrations, which had at last proved so effective and had vindicated his vision of more than 25 years, desperately needed to be taken into the Soviet Union. That vast conglomerate of republics was clearly heading for economic and political disaster. The only way to avoid chaos would be to pressure the Kremlin into taking the right course, but his hands were tied. Roger's group had from the very beginning steadfastly refused to allow Ari to extend his efforts into the USSR. Obviously, they were protecting their partner, Gorbachev, just as they were protecting the United States and Western Europe from the same disruptions. Elsewhere, in the former Soviet satellite countries, the student protests had done their work and were obsolete. The unsung genius who had engineered so much of the success was beginning to feel like a man out of a job. There was only one thing to do. He had to make his break with the committee that had financed him, and he must do it without further delay. Knowing full well the extreme danger and the impossible odds, Ari began to lay his plans. On a blustery afternoon in early March, Ari, with the tickets in his pocket for a flight to Moscow the following morning, sat hunched against the cold near a phone booth close to the Château de Vincennes metro station. He had been waiting for more than 30 minutes without receiving a single call. This was one of more than 24 such locations he had frequented for years on his changing coded schedule, public phones that were seldom used by the general populace and that, in the past, had kept him busy answering incoming calls at predesignated times. Now, however, it was rare for him to receive any communication at all. Inconspicuously sitting on a bench within earshot of the phone booth, Ari was absorbed in studying a book documenting Vatican-controlled secret societies. It contained some fascinating insights that seemed to fill in gaps in the information he had been gathering through his spies inside Roger's group. There was no doubt that the Vatican-Washington alliance had only grown stronger following the key role Rome had played in saving Solidarity from extinction and in establishing Poland as a central base of resistance within communist Eastern Europe. The Vatican's almost incalculable wealth and influence, and its deliberate actions, both openly and in secret, made it a major player in the international network that was setting the stage for a new world order. Ari was now convinced that Christianity and Islam, in a modern version of the Crusades, would fight it out once again, this time for world dominion. And Christianity of all stripes and denominations, so his research had indicated, was heading for a worldwide alliance under Rome that would include all religions except Islam, and, of course, Judaism. Israel would be a thorn in both sides and increasingly isolated. Perhaps the Israelis would be cured of their stubborn Zionism, which he had never been able to stomach, the preposterous pretension that they were a special chosen people with preemptive rights to Arab land. And now, months after Abdul's defection, he was still looking unsuccessfully for someone to head up the strategic work that was so badly needed in the Middle East. Putting the book back into his briefcase, Ari stood up and stretched wearily. It was time to leave, and not even one call had come through. Pulling his full-length leather coat close about him, He turned to lean into the stiff wind that had been howling down the broad avenues and lanes of Paris for the past 3 days. He was just starting to walk away when the phone rang. It was a minute past the scheduled time slot for calls at this phone booth. Probably it wasn't for him. On the unlikely chance that it might be a late call, Ari turned casually back and picked up the receiver. "Hello?" "This is Paxson," announced a voice vibrant with suppressed alarm. "It's late here." "Later than you think," said Ari quickly, giving the emergency identifying response and feeling his heart start to beat faster. "They're going to terminate you. I said terminate. I think they're on to me, too. I've got to go underground. I need 300,000 francs in cash, at the drop, tonight." "I'll take care of it. Listen, everyone pull out. Pass the word." Instead of shock, Ari felt almost relieved. Of course, he'd known this was coming. They couldn't let him proceed with his plans. Moscow, and everything that trip would have led to, was suddenly and with shattering finality a lost dream. Someday, maybe. But now there was only one goal: survival. It would be the focus of all his attention, energy, and skill. And to pull it off, if it could be done at all, would involve a dangerous gamble. First of all, he had to shake the shadowy protection that had dogged his every step. He had not bothered to lose them for at least 6 months, so they wouldn't be likely to expect him to do so now. Surprise was worth 2 or 3 minutes, and that could be crucial. He knew exactly what he would do, having planned the necessary steps for every location that he frequented. There was a public toilet that backed up to an alley not far away, and Ari headed for it at a brisk pace, though not so fast as to arouse suspicion. If those two behind him knew of the order to terminate him, at least they weren't the ones assigned to do the job, or he wouldn't still be alive. That meant he had some time, but at best very little. Entering the WC, Ari noted with relief that it was empty. There was a small window in the rear over one of the toilets through which he quickly crawled, dropped down into the alley, and ran to a main street 50 yards away. Exiting the alley, he hurried toward a large intersection. Before reaching it, he had flagged down a passing cab. Once inside, he slumped down low in his seat and carefully peered out the windows. There was no sign of his protectors, who must have been, by then, in a panic. "Banque Française Internationale," said Ari, giving the cab driver the name of the closest bank where he had a large account. When they had reached that destination, he handed the cabbie a 500-franc note. "I've got several more stops to make," Ari announced in a trusting tone. "I'll only be a few minutes. Wait for me, okay? I'll make it worth your while." "Bien sûr, monsieur," responded the driver eagerly. It was mid-afternoon, and the lines at the tellers' cages were frustratingly long. Rather than choosing the shortest one, Ari stood in the queue leading to the teller he knew best, a pleasant young woman who was familiar with his account and would recognize him. Not only did Paxson need cash, but so did he. This would be the last chance. There was a balance of about 1.5 million francs. He'd leave enough not to attract undue attention. While standing in line, Ari took from his briefcase the checkbook for this particular bank. Here he was known as Jean-Claude Hébert, and of course had all of the necessary identification to prove it. He wrote a check to himself for 1.2 million francs and presented it to the teller when he finally reached her. "Bonjour, Monsieur Hébert," she greeted him warmly. "Haven't seen you in several months. Been traveling again, I suppose?" "Yeah, too much," responded Ari dryly. "But you have to make a living. C'est la vie." "Do you want a cashier's check?" "No, I'd like it in cash." "I'll have to go to the vault." "Can I give it to you in 10,000-franc notes?" "Okay, but give me 200,000 in 5,000 francs." The teller punched his account number into the computer. "Let me just make sure you have enough to cover this." Her eyebrows rose in surprise. "I'm showing that your account has been closed." "Impossible. That account should have about 1.5 million francs in it right now." "Oh, I see. There's a note in the computer to have you speak with the manager." Ari was thinking rapidly. It couldn't possibly be a mistake. They've wiped out all of my accounts. Having me speak with the manager is just a ploy to hold me here until the police, or the assassins, arrive. "You bet I want to speak with the manager. Immediately," replied Jean-Claude indignantly. "But I've got a taxi waiting for me outside. Let me tell him to go on. I'll be right back." Hurrying out of the bank, Ari jumped into the cab. "Place d'Enfer Rochereau," he said, pulling a distant location out of the air. Getting there would give him time to think. He had put 5 million francs away in a safe deposit box at another bank, but it was too risky to go there under these conditions. He cursed himself for being lax. He should have been carrying an emergency fund with him. Ari's mind was now a turmoil of both anxiety and anger. The irony was maddening. Success put me out of business. I've lost the students I controlled. Most of the leaders I trained and worked with are running for political office in Eastern Europe's new wave of democracy. I failed to crack the Arab world, and my organization was smashed in China. They're desperately afraid of what I might do in the Soviet Union and in the West. They don't want me operating anymore. I'm a threat. They've got to kill me.